The message arrived on a quiet afternoon, the kind of afternoon that usually carries peace with it. I was sitting by the window, folding laundry that was still warm from the sun. The house smelled faintly of soap and clean cotton. Outside, the light was soft, the way it gets when the day isn't in a hurry to end. Everything felt gentle, familiar, safe. My phone vibrated beside me. I smiled without thinking. A mother never outgrows that habit. No matter how old her children become, her heart still lifts when their name appears on a screen. Even at my age, that small hope lived quietly inside me. It was my son. But the smile didn't last. The message was short. No greeting, no warmth. Please don't interfere. My wife feels uncomfortable. Respect our space. That was all. No mom, no explanation, no kindness to soften the words, just a clean, cold sentence that landed heavier than any argument ever could. I read it again, slowly this time. Then again. I waited for something else to appear, a follow-up message, a correction, an apology, maybe even a small heart emoji to say, I didn't mean it the way it sounds. Nothing came. The screen stayed silent, but the meaning grew louder. My hands began to shake. I placed the folded towel on my lap and stared straight ahead at the wall, as if it might explain what had just happened. My mind raced, searching for excuses that could protect my heart. Maybe he was angry. Maybe it was written in a bad moment. Maybe someone else had typed it. But deep down, I knew the truth. Words like that don't come from nowhere. Memories rushed in without permission. The nights I stayed awake beside his bed when he had a fever. The lunches I packed carefully, always slipping in a small note so he wouldn't feel alone at school. The years I worked extra hours, quietly saving so he could go to university without the weight of worry pressing down on his shoulders. I remembered his small hand in mine. I'll always take care of you, Mama, he once said. Now, I was being told I was interfering. What hurt most wasn't the request for space. Every family deserves space. What hurt was how suddenly I had been turned into a stranger, as if all those years had been erased by a single sentence. I picked up my phone and started to type a reply. Then I stopped. Because in that moment, something inside me understood this message wasn't asking for understanding. It was drawing a line. And I had no idea yet how deeply that line would change my life. After reading that message, I didn't cry right away. I sat there, still holding the phone, as if my body needed time to catch up with what my heart already knew. The house felt the same, but something inside me had shifted, like a picture frame knocked slightly crooked, never quite straight again. My thoughts drifted backward without asking permission. I saw him as a little boy again. Small hands, scraped knees, a voice calling for me in the middle of the night because he'd had a bad dream. I remembered how I used to sit on the edge of his bed, rubbing his back until his breathing slowed, whispering that everything would be all right, even when I wasn't sure myself. I remembered the school mornings, rushing but careful, making sure his clothes were clean, his shoes tied just right, packing lunches with the kind of care only a mother understands. Sometimes I'd slip in a note, nothing special, just a reminder that he was loved, that someone was thinking about him even when he couldn't see me. As he grew older, the sacrifices changed shape, but they never stopped. Extra hours at work when money was tight, saying no to myself so I could say yes to his future, saving quietly, patiently, so he could go to university without the weight of worry pressing down on his shoulders. I never spoke about it. I never wanted credit. Watching him move forward was enough. I remembered the day he left home. How proud I was. How I smiled and waved until the car disappeared, then went inside and cried where no one could see. That's what mothers do. We let go quietly. Even after he married, I stayed careful. I didn't want to intrude. I offered help when it seemed needed, a home-cooked meal when they were exhausted, covering a small bill when things were difficult, advice only when I believed it was welcome. Never control, never demands, only support. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I wonder when love began to look like interference, when kindness slowly transformed into obligation, when my presence stopped feeling comforting and started feeling inconvenient. I replayed conversations in my mind, searching for the moment I crossed a line. But all I found were years of giving, years of standing just close enough to help and far enough to respect. And that's when a painful realization settled in. Sometimes the problem isn't what you give. It's how quietly you give it. Because when love is always available, people stop seeing its cost. And sitting there, with my phone resting silently in my hand, I began to understand that this message wasn't just about a message. It was about everything that came before it. After that message, I began replaying moments I had never questioned before. Not arguments, not loud disagreements, just small, ordinary things. I thought about the meals I brought over when they were exhausted after long workdays. I never arrived unannounced. I always called first. I remembered standing in their kitchen, quietly washing dishes while they rested, believing I was helping them breathe a little easier. I thought about the times I paid a bill without making a sound about it. No lectures, no reminders, just a quiet transfer, followed by, "Don't worry, you can pay me back later." And when later never came, I let it go. Love doesn't keep receipts. Or at least, I thought it didn't. I remembered offering advice when they asked, at least when I believed they were asking, a question about childcare, a comment about budgeting, a suggestion spoken gently, always ending with, "But you know what's best." I had learned long ago that marriage is delicate, that a mother must walk carefully once her child builds a new life. I believed I was walking that line with care. So when I read the word interfering, it stunned me. I wondered when support became pressure, when concern became criticism, when love began to feel like intrusion. I searched my memory for raised voices or crossed boundaries. I found none. Only presence, only availability, only a willingness to help without being asked. And slowly, painfully, another truth emerged. Sometimes the problem isn't what you give, it's what people don't want. My love had become inconvenient because it reminded them of what they hadn't yet learned to handle on their own. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me tired. Tired of explaining intentions, tired of defending my love for caring too much. I understood then that I had crossed an invisible line, not by doing something wrong, but by staying too long in a role they were ready to outgrow. What hurt wasn't being asked to step back. What hurt was being labeled a problem for loving the only way I knew how. That word, interfering, echoed in my mind like a verdict, as if all the years of devotion had been reduced to a flaw. And in that quiet, uncomfortable truth, I felt something begin to change inside me. Not anger, not resentment, awareness. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. At what point does giving become losing yourself? I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew one thing. If my love was now being treated as an inconvenience, then perhaps the kindest thing I could do, for them and for myself,
was to step back and finally listen to the silence I had been avoiding. I stared at the message for a long time before my fingers finally moved. I typed a reply, deleted it, typed again, slower this time, choosing words carefully, trying to sound calm, understanding, reasonable, trying to explain that I never meant to interfere, that I only wanted to help, that I would step back if that's what they needed. Then I erased it again. My hands hovered over the screen, but my heart felt strangely heavy, as if it already knew something my mind was still resisting. I realized that no explanation would soften those words, because the message wasn't written to invite a conversation. It was written to end one. And suddenly, I felt It was the slow erasing of my own needs, the habit of placing myself last, the quiet belief that being useful was the same as being loved. For years, I had confused sacrifice with connection. I remembered moments that stung now when I looked back. Casual requests made without hesitation, assumptions spoken instead of questions, the way help was expected, not appreciated. And yet, I never complained, because mothers aren't supposed to keep score. We're supposed to give freely, endlessly, without pause. But no one talks about what happens when giving becomes the only reason you're kept close. That realization settled heavily in my chest. I had never been asked if I was tired. No one wondered if I needed help. My strength had been assumed, not honored. And suddenly, the message on my phone made sense. I hadn't been interfering. I had been available. And availability, when taken for granted, becomes uncomfortable for those who depend on it. That night, something changed quietly but firmly. I decided I would stop rescuing, stop fixing, stop smoothing over struggles that weren't mine to carry anymore. Not as punishment, not out of bitterness, but out of recognition. I deserved to be valued for who I was, not just for what I provided. And in that realization, painful as it was, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Because for the first time, I understood that love should never require self-erasure. And the moment I stopped giving automatically, I wasn't becoming colder. I was becoming whole. The first few days of silence were the hardest. Every instinct in me wanted to reach out, to explain, to check in, to make sure everything was all right, even if it wasn't my place anymore. I had spent a lifetime responding, fixing, smoothing things over. Silence felt unnatural, almost wrong. The house felt too quiet at first. Each sound stood alone. The clink of a cup, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock that seemed louder than ever. Without conversation or obligation filling the space, the silence pressed in on me, asking questions I had avoided for years. But slowly, something unexpected happened. The silence stopped accusing me. It began to observe me. I noticed how quickly I reached for my phone out of habit, ready to solve problems that hadn't been asked of me. I noticed how often my thoughts revolved around their needs instead of my own. And for the first time, I asked myself a question that felt both strange and necessary. Who am I when I am not needed? At first, that question frightened me. So much of my life had been built around being useful, being dependable, being the one everyone could count on. But in the quiet, I realized that usefulness had become my identity, and I had allowed it to replace something deeper, self-respect. Days passed, then weeks. I began filling my time with small, intentional moments, reading books I had put aside for years, taking slow walks around the neighborhood, sitting with my tea without rushing to do anything else. I started noticing my breathing, my thoughts, my own emotional weight, and I realized how long it had been since I listened to myself. The silence didn't erase the pain. I still thought about my son, about my grandson, about the life that once felt intertwined with mine. But the ache softened as clarity grew. I saw how often I had overextended myself, believing that closeness required constant sacrifice. I saw how I had confused love with availability and patience with self-denial. Silence showed me the difference. Love that heals leaves room to breathe. Love that diminishes demands silence from the giver. And for the first time, I wasn't silencing myself for anyone else. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the window as the sunlight poured in. I looked older, yes, but steadier, less rushed, less afraid of being misunderstood. I wasn't being punished by distance. I was being taught by it. Silence had given me something I hadn't known I needed: perspective. And with that perspective came a quiet understanding. Stepping back was not abandonment. It was an act of balance, of maturity, of respect for them and, finally, for myself. In the stillness, I felt something new take root. Not loneliness, strength. It was late morning when I heard the knock at the door. Not a gentle one. Sharp, insistent. My heart reacted before my mind could. That familiar rush of hope rose in my chest, the kind a mother never fully unlearns. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine an apology, an explanation, a soft, "we miss you," waiting on the other side. But the hope faded quickly. I had learned by then that hope can be heavy when it's misplaced. I stood still for a moment before letting my breath settle, before walking to the door. When I opened it, there they were, my son and his wife, standing awkwardly on the porch. My grandson clutched his small backpack, blissfully unaware of the tension thick in the air. My son smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It looked practiced, rehearsed. "Mom," he said, too casually, "we just wanted to talk." There was no apology in his voice, no mention of the message that had wounded me so deeply, just urgency, thinly disguised as concern. I stepped aside and let them in. The house felt different with them inside, smaller, tighter, as if it remembered everything I had chosen not to say. We sat in the living room. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. I poured tea with steady hands, placing the cups carefully on the table. I moved slowly, deliberately, refusing to let old habits rush me into comfort mode. Finally, my son cleared his throat. "We've been struggling a bit," he said. "Bills, the apartment, things are just tight." I listened without interrupting. I didn't nod in reassurance. I didn't rush to solve anything. I simply listened. As he spoke, I understood something with painful clarity. They hadn't come to reconnect. They had come because something had stopped. My help. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, the way he used to when he was younger, waiting for me to step in, to rescue, to smooth things over. I took a slow breath. "I understand," I said calmly, "but things are different now." The room grew still. I've realized that love doesn't need to prove itself through money or favors. I've been giving for a long time, and I need to protect my own peace. His expression shifted: surprise, discomfort, disbelief. "You'll have to manage this yourselves," I said gently. "I believe you can." No anger, no accusation, just truth. They exchanged glances, then gathered their things. My grandson lingered near the door, looking back at me with innocent curiosity. I smiled softly at him. "I'll see you soon, but it's time for you to grow on your own." As the door closed behind them, I stood still in the quiet. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't begged, I had held my boundary. and for the first time, I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. Silence had prepared me for this moment, and I had passed the test. After they left that day, the house felt different. Not empty, not lonely, lighter. It was as if the walls themselves had exhaled a breath they had been holding for years. I stood in the quiet living room for a long moment, listening, not for footsteps, not for voices, but for myself. For the first time in a very long while, I felt fully present in my own home. The days that followed were unfamiliar in gentle ways. No sudden messages asking for help, no quiet emergencies waiting to be solved, no unspoken expectations hovering in the air. There was silence, yes, but it was intentional now. I began tending to parts of my life I had neglected without realizing it. Books I had once wanted to read sat patiently on my shelves, finally opened. I returned to hobbies I had set aside for years: gardening, knitting, long walks around the neighborhood where I could move at my own pace without urgency. I started noticing my breathing, my thoughts, my own emotional weight, and I realized how long it had been since I listened to myself. The silence didn't erase the pain. I still thought about my son, about my grandson, about the life that once felt intertwined with mine. But the ache softened as clarity grew. I saw how often I had overextended myself, believing that closeness required constant sacrifice. I saw how I had confused love with availability and patience with self-denial.